So I'll introduce myself. I'm Chris Puddock. I'm the the chair of the Rotarian Action Group, Environmental Sustainability. And we in SRAG have task forces, and this task force that we're working on today is biodiversity. And so we're looking at pollinators, and pollinator of choice for today is the most famous butterfly in the United States and North America, which is the monarch butterfly. And I would like to welcome everybody that's on the call today. And please hold your questions to the end. There will be, Ariel will be taking the questions, and so there'll be Q&A at the end. So hold your questions to then. We'll address as many questions as we can at that time. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and bring up the PowerPoint that we have. We all know the monarch. I'm not going to spend very much time on the life history of the monarch. It's just an amazing creature. It has an amazing migration, and a lot of people know about this migration. It is it's the endangered part of the monarch. It's the monarch species itself is not endangered, but the migration, both on the center of America and on the West Coast, is really endangered. It's embedded into school curricula. This butterfly has taken over from what was the butterfly in school curricula, which is the painted lady, and it doesn't have anywhere near the migration. So, and there's so many of these butterflies. So what's the problem? And that's what we're going to deal with today. And I don't know why I'm just not moving. For some reason, my screen didn't move. So we have 5 presenters, including myself, and we'll be running through the whole of the broad spectrum of the butterfly in North America. As I mentioned, this is really charismatic, and I'll come back to the slide a little bit later on. But just to give you perspective, the egg in the top left is about the same size as the head that's come off of this instar that's just grown, and so you can see that in the top left, just to give you a perspective of the size. Metamorphosis, everybody sort of knows this. If you've seen this, it's just a magnificent thing to watch. I'd like to just mention that milkweeds are the food source for the caterpillar. And so the milkweeds are also threatened because these milkweeds are actually pollinated by big bees. And the photograph on the left, you will see that the bees are actually pulling out these packets of pollen. It's not like the typical pollen. Milkweed has pollen in sacs, and those sacs are taken away. And so we need big bees, and the big bees are also threatened, as Mace could probably tell you that as well. So without further ado, and we'll get back to some of those points a bit later, I'm going to introduce now Cesar Murillo, who's going to be talking to us in Spanish for the first probably about 7 minutes or so. And then William Dent will come in at the end of that to just give a recap and follow on from that about the monarchs down in Mexico. Cesar has a master's in environmental law from the American University. And until January 2020, Cesar worked for Semarnat, the Mexican government secretariat for the environment and natural resources here in Washington, and at the Embassy of Mexico. Cesar is assistant to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in programs such as the one which has led to the forming of this new Monarch Corridor initiative in Mexico, which you'll be hearing about. So over to you, Cesar.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for the time. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be at this meeting today. I am going to talk some data in Spanish about the monarch butterfly in Mexico, and I appreciate this opportunity. Para México, la mariposa monarca ha significado un viaje que va más allá de una preocupación actual. La vinculación de la monarca con la cultura, incluso en México, tiene muchos años, que data incluso de la comunidad Mazahua, indígena en México, donde han considerado que al momento de la llegada de la mariposa monarca a México, se celebra y se recuerda la llegada de las personas que ya no están, nuestros difuntos. Los mazahuas consideraban que en las alas de la mariposa venían los espíritus o la presencia de nuestros antepasados para estar con nosotros y llegar a los altares que en esta época en México se ponen por el Día de Muertos, el 31, 1 y 2 de noviembre, 31 de octubre, 1 y 2 de noviembre. Y bueno, este maravilloso viaje que ha tenido lugar a través de la mariposa y que se ha compartido el interés desde Canadá, Estados Unidos y México para saber y conocer su ruta, pues sin duda ha tenido pues efectos positivos enormes para conocer la enorme biodiversidad y los beneficios ambientales que representa esta especie, pero también nos ha permitido darnos cuenta de los riesgos no solo naturales, sino también del hombre que genera en su hábitat. Y esto es por las actividades un poco clandestinas que hay por la tala del hábitat de la mariposa. Este viaje que ya se ha mencionado de más de 400,000 kilómetros que hace la mariposa, tiene al final una ruta que es un beneficio ambiental muy claro, que es la polinización. Y en México, esta situación ha tenido lugar que se busque proteger la zona de hibernación de la mariposa desde de los años 70. En 1970 empezó la protección de la mariposa. En los años 80 se generaron varios decretos para proteger la zona, y es a partir del año 2000 donde se conoce como la Reserva de la Biosfera de la Mariposa Monarca. Al día de hoy, cada vez más personas y más empresas también han expresado su preocupación de proteger a la mariposa monarca. Sin embargo, esta actuación no se extingue en un solo año, en un solo momento, sino es importante poder continuar. Y para nosotros, la mariposa y Rotarios ha sido una experiencia formidable. Rotarios, la posibilidad para nosotros de haber conocido la fuerza y la iniciativa que tiene Rotarios para acabar con problemas tan grandes, obviamente, como ha sido el tema de la polio, la posibilidad de que entre un programa de apoyo como es de Rotarios para la mariposa monarca a través de una iniciativa de corredores, nos permite recordar no solamente que es importante el lugar de hibernación, sino también la ruta que va siguiendo la mariposa a lo largo de todo el trayecto. Así que si ponemos atención en los corredores donde la mariposa atraviesa, es una posibilidad muy importante de no solo conservar el ecosistema, sino recordarnos a nosotros mismos la importancia de proteger la ruta migratoria. En México, la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales, Semarnat, es la encargada de cuidar la zona o de regular las zonas donde habita la mariposa. Y le ha dado en administración a la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas, la CONAM, el resguardo de estas áreas que año con año buscan prevalecer y conservar. Sin duda, la iniciativa de corredores tiene una característica muy importante, y es que no solamente va enfocada realmente hacia los adultos. Es una iniciativa que está enfocada a que los niños y las nuevas generaciones conozcan esta importante especie, pero sobre todo que conozcan la oportunidad de trabajar de manera conjunta. Y el proyecto de corredores, así como el proyecto que en su momento ya tiene lugar su inicio a través de escuelas hermanas de protección de la mariposa monarca, a través de la iniciativa que en su momento tuvo William Dent, Natural Partners y Rotarios, ha tenido muy buenos ejemplos que me gustaría si William nos hace favor de explicar un poco más acerca de estos grandes resultados. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much, Cesar. I'll recap very briefly in English what you were talking about, namely what the Mexican government has already done since the mid-1980s to protect the areas where the monarch butterfly spends the winter. And it's not only those areas that are important, but the corridor down from the border with the US on the Rio Grande, down some 1,000 kilometers, about 600 miles, to the Monarch Biosphere Reserve, which is where our schools are located. And it's really an amazing migration, and the fact that the monarch butterflies return to the very same groves of forest where their great-grandparents were the year before. It's a long-lived generation, about an insect, can you imagine, that lives 9 months, makes a 2,000-mile migration from southern Canada and northern United States down to central Mexico, truly shared by all three countries. It's truly a bridge across cultures and the countries themselves. And then the monarchs spend 4.5 months in the forest. Most of them are in the Biosphere Reserve, which is on border between Michoacan State and Mexico State. It's precisely there where a little over 10 years ago, my nonprofit, Natural Partners, established a program called the Monarch Sister Schools Program. We had done some work with WWF Mexico, and actually it was Cesar, coincidentally, who got me in touch with the leaders of WWF in Mexico. And we worked with the community. There are some 40 communities that literally own the land collectively where the monarchs go. It's privately held land. Very little is actually government owned. So we thought it's wonderful that WWF, and I'm talking about elementary school, middle school children, they're the future. They're the ones who need to have the awareness and to be the future leaders of the preservation of these areas. So we started a program that provides three things. One is getting them involved in habitat restoration. And this is the lower left-hand image of this slide shows the small trees, the seedlings that the children take care of. And within about a year, they're big enough to be taken up into areas of the forest that need restoration, either due to fire or illegal logging. And so the children are involved in raising the baby trees, mainly oyamel, which is the preferred tree of the monarchs. And there are also a few other species, cedro, which is cedar. There's a Michoacan pine that's quite prevalent too. But the monarchs actually like the upper areas of the forest from 7,500 feet to more than 10,000 feet. And that's where you find the oyamel trees. So this is an ongoing project of the children in Mexico. We're working with 5 schools, and all of the schools have tree nurseries, which you can see here. They also have pollinator gardens, which is what we want to be installing along a corridor area where we hope to work with more schools. We started working right next to the Monarch Biosphere Reserve, which is about 2 hours west of Mexico City, 10 years ago. And now we have an opportunity with Rotarians, and I happen to be a Rotarian. Chris is a Rotarian, and we feel that with the help of the Rotarians who can help raise the money and exercise the adult leadership, that we can mobilize a lot more schools in Mexico for the corridor, the flyway, which you can see here. We're down where the big green spot is, just above the name of the state of Michoacan. And that's been wonderful, and that gives us a great experience to build on. But now we plan, with the help of fellow Rotarians and other groups like Reforestamos Mexico, to work with additional schools and other partners to build out pollinator gardens that will provide the nectar that the monarchs need when they're coming south on their way to the Biosphere Reserve, and when they're heading north back to the United States. And they actually return to Texas, where the females lay their eggs come around April. So it's an amazing journey, not only down to Mexico, which is about 2,000 miles, but back to Texas, that this long-lived generation has. So here are a list of some of our collaborators. We actually have the Ministry of Foreign Relations that even suggested the idea that we expand the program and create this corridor we're talking about, which will connect with the corridor that Rotarians are already doing in the United States, which you'll see in a next presentation. So we're very thankful for that, and looking forward to working with the Rotary clubs in Mexico and Reforestamos Mexico and other allies. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cesar, for your presentation, and it's great working with you again.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, William and Cesar. That's really great. We're now going to turn over to the center part of the United States, where Judith Freund is going to be talking to us. Judith has worked with the conservation of monarch butterflies in the Central Flyway for many years. She is a retired educator and past district governor of Rotary District 5960. She's one of the founders of the Rotary program, Operation Pollination. This program encourages people to make their own pollinator resolution and lists partners to sign a pollinator pledge. And you're going to be hearing more about that as Judith takes it away right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Christopher. My name is Judy Freund, and I'm sitting here in beautiful Hudson, Wisconsin. And I will speak to you this morning in a solid Midwest accent. Thank you so much, Cesar, for presenting your information in Spanish. And I am honored to be on this webinar with folks that truly are experts in this field. I'm not. As Chris said, I'm a classroom teacher, and I'm also a very concerned citizen. It is my great pleasure to sort of, in a way, continue that story about this envisioned corridor that's in Mexico and continue it up into the central part of the United States by telling you about Operation Pollination. It's an idea that's migrating out of Minnesota and is truly now becoming international in scope. So when the monarchs leave Mexico, as we heard, sometime in spring, they follow the Central Flyway on their journey north. It takes several generations for them to complete their migration. And the butterflies that are now returning to the mountains in central Mexico are the great-grandchildren of those monarchs that left there last spring. When the monarchs butterflies leave the reserve and they arrive somewhere in the southern US, they will deposit eggs on milkweed. The adult will then fly away and die shortly thereafter, leaving the fate of the species scattered across the landscape. Then the second generation must continue the migration. The caterpillar becomes the adult, and the adult knows what to do. Go north and fine milkweed on which they will deposit their eggs. The adults only live several months, so it will take several more generations before we see the monarchs arriving in the northern US and Canada. And now those great-grandchildren are headed back to Mexico. My friend Chris Stein reminds me that this generation migrating now are called super monarchs, because if we just heard, they must live longer and travel farther, thousands of miles, so as not to disrupt the cycle of life. I, in my mind, imagine this super monarch getting somewhere on their journey and saying, I'm so tired, this is so hard. Can't I just stay here in Nebraska? But they know that they have to continue on. This migration north and then the return south happens in a matter of months, and we can watch this cycle before our eyes. Next slide, please. Monarchs face numerous threats on their journey. These include loss of habitat for monoculture plantings, mowing practices that destroy nectar plants that the monarchs need to feed, the adult monarchs need to feed on, the use of pesticides, herbicides, and such that have unintended consequences, climate change, and there's others, I suppose. Next slide, please. I'm sure that at some point you've all asked yourself, you know, what do people absolutely need to survive? I don't know, maybe you'd say water, some such thing. Those threats that I just mentioned point to the one thing that the monarch must have to survive, milkweed, of course. The intuition of the adult butterfly directs her to deposit her eggs on the milkweed so that when the caterpillar emerges, it can feed on the plant, and it can only eat milkweed. And it's very important to point out that it needs to be native milkweed to your area. The monarchs that arrive in Minnesota are not the ones that left Mexico. So you can't be thinking in your mind, well, they come from Mexico, they must like tacos. No, ours were born somewhere in Iowa, for heaven's sake. In my region, considered the Northeast, there are 5 types of native milkweeds. There are also 5 types in Oklahoma and Texas, but they are not the same. There's only 2, I believe, that are common. In this picture, it's a picture of a seed collection effort by a nonprofit called Project Wingspan. Project Wingspan, which includes most of the states along the Mississippi, organized volunteers to collect native pollinator seeds, and then it redistributes them to organizations wanting to enhance pollinator-friendly plants on their property. The folks in this photo are Rotarians, and they're collecting seeds from the world milkweed, which, by the way, I believe is one of the native plants in Texas and Oklahoma as well. They're in a community of Osceola, Wisconsin, just north of my hometown of Hudson. Next slide, please. Awareness of the pending pollinator crisis was elevated during the Obama administration. The then White House designated I-35 as the pollinator highway. The dots in this map roughly follow the highway. You can see I-35 runs through the Central Flyway. The northern end of I-35 in Minnesota includes my Rotary District, 5960. All these dots represent project ideas that have been or are in the works. One of Operation Pollination's visions is to continue that pollinator corridor in Mexico and to continue it along I-35, the pollinator highway, and populate it with projects that create a continuous corridor of pollinator-friendly habitat. Now, obviously, this imagined corridor extends well beyond the highway itself. You know, butterflies don't say, oh no, we should have turned at Wichita. The highway's a metaphor. The I-35 road is a continuous, uninterrupted route from Minnesota to Mexico. It's a visual for a continuous, uninterrupted habitat corridor for pollinators. You don't need to be in the Central Flyway to do a project. You're going to hear in just a minute a lot of actions that need to be taken in the western part of the United States as well as in the east. So that cluster of dots up there in Minnesota, they represent dozens of projects that were done all over our district and not just hovering over I-35 highway. Next slide, please. In 2015, then District Governor Marlene Gargalack and Chris Stein, the superintendent of the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway at that time, entered into a collaboration to encourage Rotary clubs in our district to identify and undertake pollinator projects in their communities that educate or take action to protect habitat. Clubs were further encouraged to seek out other community organizations to join them by pledging to do a pollinator project of their own, big or small. This is the story, by the way, that's told in the October issue of the Rotary magazine. That effort then was called the Pollinator Partnership and is now Operation Pollination. Next slide, please. Many organizations have signed a pollinator pledge and many continue to be added. These include government agencies and nonprofits, as you see here, but also businesses, large and small, ones that we all recognize. Xcel Energy is the large energy provider in Minnesota, and they pledge to plant nectar plants on property that they own. Other energy companies in the Midwest have committed to doing projects as well, and not just energy companies. That previous slide, that photo was taken at the property of Anderson Window Corporation. So don't allow yourself to be saying, oh, that's just a big company. They're not going to be interested in any pollinator project. Companies are made up of people, and on an individual basis, people get it. Next slide, please. So the Operation Pollination idea is very simple. When you or a group that you're part of, when you understand what is at stake, and when you understand that you can make a difference, you can do something, then create a pollinator resolution. The resolution might say something that like pollinators are essential if we like to eat. Over 60% of the foods we eat depend on pollinators. The current pandemic has highlighted issues of food insecurity. Habitat for pollinators is threatened, often unintentionally. And if we lose pollinators, we lose food insecurity. So then resolve to do something, resolve to educate, resolve to take action to protect and restore habitat. Resolve to change behaviors that threaten habitat. Resolve, well, whatever you feel you want to state in your resolution. Then, second, find organizations to sign a pledge stating their commitment to do a specific project, big or small. By doing this, by getting cluster groups to make this commitment, you will leverage your impact. You're going to be expanding and growing that biological corridor along the pollinator highway. Think of the impact that your Rotary Club or district can have by reaching out to pollinator groups. Then collect those names of your collaborators. All those names on that lower right-hand corner, these are signers of that original 2015 resolution. They represent projects. Some are Rotary clubs, some are individuals, some are small businesses, and some are the Xcel Energies of the world. Lastly, spread the word. That article in the Rotary magazine about Operation Pollination, that is spreading the word. Clubs are contacting us and say, we're going to do something. So Operation Pollination is really so simple. Any organization can create a resolution, anybody can sign the pledge, anybody can participate. Operation Pollination can cost a lot or it can cost nothing, depending on the project. And you decide what you want to do. We do not tell you. We don't even tell you what pollinator means. Hummingbirds are pollinators. Bees are pollinators. So whatever captures your interest, and I said earlier, of course, it doesn't have to be in the central US. We chose to focus on monarchs because, well, like Christopher Puttick calls the monarch a charismatic species. I love that. Think about it. If a monarch lands on your shoulder, and there's a child or a grandchild nearby, Judy, my gosh, don't move, don't move. There's a butterfly on your shoulder. Don't move, it's so beautiful. I don't want it to go away. Well, you get the idea, and I rest my case. Next slide, please. Actually, it is time to move, or the monarch will go away. You see the Operation Pollination website address here? Please contact us. Please ask for a presentation to your club. You also see here two folks. I'm in the middle, and Karen McDaniel is next to me. Karen and I are the co-chairs of the Pollinator Task Rag for SRAG in our region. And I'm sure you all recognize that we are this close photo, Rotary's polio eradication photo. But regarding pollinators, we are this close to needing to move now. Or you may never hear a grandchild say, Judy, there's a butterfly on your shoulder. I don't want it to go away. But anytime a club or a district steps up, you can be a super club that goes the distance, even though there's going to be times when you're going to say, this is hard. This is too much work. Can't we just stay here in Nebraska? But super clubs create resolutions. Super clubs find partners and they leverage their impact. And when clubs do that, we're this close to assuring that the life cycle of the monarch continues. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Judy. That was really great. And thanks for that push for Operation Pollination, which I hope will be taking off around America. Next, I'm going to invite William Dent. You can see the slide here is a transition slide, Emerging Success. And we've had quite a bit of success in the East. William Dent, I'd like to introduce him now. He's the president-elect for the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C. He began, as you heard earlier, the Monarch Sister School program in 2008 as a part of Natural Partners. This was to bring connections between schools down in Michigan and in Maryland and DC, as where we have some bilingual schools. But anyway, so right now I'd like to turn it over to William to talk to us about the monarchs in the East.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. My pleasure. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having helped me in what was then a brand new program, a Monarch Sister Schools program, plant many gardens. Chris and I probably planted a good 30 gardens at schools, principally. And Chris continues to run the Chesapeake Natives Nursery, which is our main source for native perennial plants that are so important for these pollinator gardens. So as Chris was saying, we started the program in 2008. And actually, it seems so much from the very beginning a Rotary thing. Actually got our first grant from the foundation of the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C. I met Cesar Murillo in late 2006 through Rotary. And here things have come full circle, working with him again in Mexico. But just let me tell you very briefly what the program's about. I had run the North American Association for Environmental Education, which coincidentally works with the same 3 countries to which the monarch belongs and is shared. And initially, thanks to Cesar, I made a connection with the World Wildlife Fund of Mexico because I had heard about the illegal logging of the forests where the monarchs spend the winter. And as I said earlier, we have this long-lived generation of monarchs who emerge and usually in September, and they begin the journey down to Mexico, whether it's from southern Canada or as close by as Maryland here, or Minnesota, Montana, all those different groups head down to the Rio Grande and converge, and then they make their way into Mexico, arriving in Mexico just about this time. Today happens to be the 2nd of November, which is the famous Day of the Dead. And Cesar earlier commented on the significance of that. But initially we were working with the adults in the communities within the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, which is about 2 hours west of Mexico City. It's a place where I take a group every year. It's a wonderful place to visit. It's an absolutely amazing experience to see the millions of monarchs. And there are various groups that are working with those communities that collectively own the land that was designated as the Biosphere Reserve. But we felt that the younger generation who are going to inherit all of this need to be aware of it and need the skills to help take care and be good stewards of this area, needed to be brought in. And that's what our program did. And the first component of our program, both in the US and Mexico, is getting the children involved in habitat restoration. In the US, that's mainly the pollinator gardens that I've done a lot of with Chris and Chesapeake Natives. And in Mexico, it's the forest. They love my trees, as I say. They love the OUML trees. I was very much involved in forestry before starting this program. So this slide shows kind of the prairie habitat. When I was growing up, milkweed was just a part of the landscape in Maryland. And in the Midwest, the same. There are different varieties depending on the region. And from the beginning, our program, it was a collaboration with Rotarians, and you'll be seeing some slides showing Rotarians, but Rotarians, Rotaractors, Interactors can all work with school children to plant butterfly gardens with milkweed. Milkweed is the host plant. It's critical to the life cycle of the monarchs. It's the only leaf that the larvae of the monarch, otherwise known as caterpillars, will eat. And that's true everywhere. And down in Mexico, the critical habitat are the trees. The forests have suffered. So we involve the children in raising baby trees, the native species. Again, it's got to be native, especially the OUMLs. For them, at the beginning of the rainy season, which is June in Mexico, to replant areas that of deteriorated forest so that the monarchs again will have the trees that they need in the future. So we are going to be collaborating with Rotary in Mexico. We have some excellent top-level contacts there. We're very excited about that, and we will have other allies. But it's all about the habitat. If the monarchs don't have their habitat, they don't have their food or their shelter. And we want to be sure that we can help restore the flyaway corridor, the migratory corridor from the Mexican border, which is the Rio Grande, down to the reserve, which is about 2 hours west of Mexico City. It's about 1,000 kilometers, 600 miles. And that's the same corridor that the monarchs, after spending 4.5 months in the reserve in Mexico, returned to Texas. And that's where it connects with the corridor that Judy was talking about a little earlier. So it's a fantastic cross binational collaboration, facilitated in large part by Rotarians like me and Chris and Judy. So we're very excited about it. And I'm looking forward to working with Cesar again. So thank you. I think we have a couple more slides, Chris.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to show the kids actually with their habitat, with their tree nurseries. Oh yeah, well this is an example of what we do in the United States as part of the Monarch Sister Schools program. Our first school in Baltimore was St. Francis of Assisi. It's a Catholic school. We work with Catholic, private, and public schools. And Chris actually created the garden plan, which you can see here. And as I said, this was our first school in Baltimore. And it included milkweed and nectar producing flowering plants. And the beauty is you go there at the beginning of the school year, say September, take the kids out and they can actually see eggs and larvae under the leaves of the milkweed. And you can clip those, bring them in, and actually raise those caterpillars or larvae. It's quite an experience. Next slide, Chris. So I think get the next slide, be able to see a tree nursery, a school-based tree nursery. That's what these. So they'll come back every year, plant them one time. Sometimes you have to replant some parts. The beautiful native plants and the time of year when they flower. And the kids will actually put in signs indicating what each section contains in terms of plants. And here we are, Rotarians. You can see me on the left-hand side there. Chris was there. Rotarians have really played a major role in planting many of the gardens around the Washington, Maryland, DC area. So go ahead and thank you, Chris. This was one of our early gardens. It was planted at a Quaker school, Friends Community School, which is located out in the Berwyn Heights area of Prince George's County in Maryland. And next. So the children, we often will have the older children shadow the younger kids. So you might have, and it's quite an experience. This was part of the team that day when we planted the garden at Friends Community School. That was our planting day. Thank you, Chris. And from the credit, I think it was Chris who took this picture. Yeah, move on. So we've planted, as I said, some 25 to 30 gardens, Chris and I. Here's another school that we did in DC, and this one is in Greenbelt, Maryland. We've usually done our annual curriculum workshop at this school. It's the Spring Hill Lake Elementary School in Prince George's County. And they planted their garden right next to the entrance of the school. So when the parents come in to visit the school, they get to see the garden, and the different groups of plants have signs showing the plant in flower, and you can see the leaf. And most of these are pollinator, nectar producing plants. We also have milkweed, of course. Next. And our very first school in 2008 was at Ann Beers in Southeast Washington, DC. And interestingly enough, I was working with a very artistic person, Cindy Nietzsche, who helped me start the program. And they designed the garden in the shape of a butterfly. And in the lower photos are of children observing common milkweed, which is very common in the eastern United States, and the favorite of the monarch butterflies for laying their eggs. And the kids use milkweed, as you know, has a lot of kind of its own little ecosystem of bugs and things. So it's fascinating for the kids. Next. So we use our Monarch-based lesson plans for hands-on STEM learning. So that's the second part of the program. First, the habitat restoration, the reinforcing the STEM learning. Here the children are keeping journals. They're actually watching the monarch larvae go through their various instars, and they can see the formation of the chrysalis, the metamorphosis, and then finally, lower left right-hand corner and upper right-hand corner, the children get to release the adult butterflies that emerge. And it's quite a memorable experience. And that's when begins the leap of imagination and the connection with the kids in Mexico. And the third part of our program is actually a cultural exchange with sister schools located just outside of the Monarch Biosphere Reserve. So they get to talk with one another, and that's quite an experience. To learn geography, they're motivated to learn Spanish and learn something about traditions such as today, the Day of the Dead. And the Mexican children learn about our big holiday in November, Thanksgiving, which is a very family affair too, since the Day of the Dead is always remembering the family members who have passed. Yeah, so here is, you can see the orange dots represent pollinator habitat that we've installed everywhere from Pennsylvania down into Virginia. And then our aspirations to install projects in Virginia, North Carolina, and right down the line through the Eastern Corridor, which will complement the Midwestern Corridor that Judy talked about. Thank you, Judy. And the next slide, Chris. And then, as I said, we do an annual workshop for teachers every year. And here are some very enthusiastic teachers. And my thanks to the various Rotary clubs, including mine, Rotary Club of Washington, D.C., the Rotary Club of Baltimore, College Park, and Greenbelt have all chipped in. Greenbelt Club is one that adopted a garden and has been there helping maintain the garden. My thanks to Chesapeake natives and Chris Puddick for the fine plants that they provided and their cooperation in planting some of those gardens. And we look forward to working with many others, including iNaturalist, which is a fantastic tool, which is on my smartphone too, right, Chris? And just a wonderful thing that allows children to continue to learn about the many native species where they live, right? So I'll end up with that. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, William. Next presenter is Mace Vaughan, and I'm going to stop screen share so that I can transfer it over to him, who will run his slides. Mace is, he serves as the Xerces Society Pollinator Conservation Program Coordinator, and as the partner biologist and pollinator conservation specialist to the United Nations, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in the West National Technology Support Center in Portland. Mace has over 20 years experience in working on insects and pollinator conservation issues across the US and abroad, including developing strategies to conserve monarch butterflies. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Mace to give us a presentation on the West.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, everybody. Just to confirm, Chris, are you able to hear me okay?
I can, yes.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks, everyone, and for those great presentations, particularly looking at the monarch in Mexico and the central and eastern flyways. For this part of the presentation, I want to draw your attention to the Western population and to the Western United States, which is a little bit unique and a little bit different from what we see in the East. So there's been obviously, we've just been talking a lot about the flyway and the multiple generations of monarchs that moved from Mexico out into the central and eastern United States. But for this part of the presentation, I want to focus on the West. The West is unique and different in that adult monarchs here, instead of flying all the way to Mexico, most of them actually fly to coastal California, and they will gather in clusters in protected microhabitats along coastal groves of trees from October until March. At this time period, they stop laying their eggs, just like in Mexico. They're really hunkering down, and this is that super generation that we were talking about before, that's done this big migration, you know, from anywhere from, well, it used to be, and I'll come back to this, from southern British Columbia, all the way back to the coast of California. They stop laying eggs and they hunker down for the winter. And there are over 400 documented overwintering sites along the California coast, stretching all the way from north of San Francisco Bay down into Baja, Mexico. I'm trying to think, in these areas, they're typically overwintering on Monterey pine, Monterey cypress would be native species. As a stopgap, where it's a loss of trees along the coast, they've even moved into groves of eucalyptus along there. And so these are important places, really a keystone in the monarch migration and population along the West. But one of the things that's quite worrisome is what we've seen in the monarch population, both overall in the eastern population. For sure, we've seen significant declines over the last 20 or 30 years, as we were talking about. But on the West, it's even more extreme. Now, we have really nice monitoring data thanks to a 30-plus year volunteer monitoring effort called the Thanksgiving and now the Thanksgiving and New Year's Day Western Monarch Count. And this is something that the Xerces Society has been managing for the last 30-odd years with help from some amazing volunteers, including Mia Monroe, who's probably our Uber volunteer along the California coast. And we've been monitoring more than 200 sites for the last 30 years. Most of them are on coastal California, a few inland, maybe a couple in Mexico and Arizona. And through this monitoring effort, we've been able to document a decline in these green bars of the total number of monarchs reported. And interestingly, we see this dramatic drop in the late 90s, and then it's been steadily low for many years. But at the same time, this blue line shows we've had a dramatic increase in the number of sites being monitored. So the monitoring effort for the last particularly 10 or 15 years has just been going up significantly, and yet we have not seen more monarchs. In addition to that, for the last 2 winters, we saw a significant additional drop in the population. Now, if we go back to data collected by scientists in the 1980s, before these volunteer efforts got started, we were seeing estimates of 3 to 10, 11, 12 million monarchs. During the course of our monitoring, it's been in the hundreds of thousands for the most part for the last 20, maybe 30 years. But in the last 2 years, we've dropped down into the tens of thousands. In fact, going from 250 to 300,000 to 28, 29,000 for the last 2 years. So if we go back to the 1980s, where we saw 160 monarch butterflies in the 80s, we now see 1. For every 160, 30 or 40 years ago, we now see 1 monarch butterfly. And those numbers in British Columbia, some of those maps you can think back to that we saw in some of the earlier presentations, had monarchs visiting eastern Washington, southern British Columbia. We do not see monarchs there today for the last couple of years. I think we documented 2 monarchs in eastern Washington this past summer. So the call to action is similar to what we've talked about or what's been discussed for the East. And I want to focus on just a couple of aspects. One, actually, I'm not going to touch on much, but if you are in a place, if you're a Rotarian living along the California coast and can play a role in protecting or managing California overwintering sites, that is, in fact, something that is really helpful. But if it's just in that one band along the coast. However, no matter where you are in the West, you can really play a role in helping to restore breeding and migratory habitat, as well as managing and protecting those summer breeding and fall migration grounds throughout the West. So I should say restore breeding and habitat in California. That's the most important place right now, but also, of course, outside of California, into Nevada, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, even British Columbia. So the focus, as you've heard already, is on planting native milkweed. I just want to reinforce that. In fact, I was realizing there are a number of resources I can put in the question and answer box as we go along. But it's important not to plant tropical milkweed. In California, that's important for two really important reasons. One, for much of the area where you would plant tropical milkweed, it will not die back. All of our native milkweeds die back. And in so doing, they break a disease cycle that we see in the monarchs. There's a disease called OE that monarchs can get, and it really reduces their ability to survive. And it's important every year for all of the milkweed in North America, well, in the US, Canada, to die back to break the disease cycle. The other thing is if you plant milkweed close to overwintering sites, it disrupts the ability for the monarch to settle into overwintering into diapause. So we want to avoid planting milkweed, especially milkweeds that don't die back, anywhere close to overwintering sites along the California coast. So focusing on planting milkweed or native milkweed is important. And we've got a number of resources on that that I'll put into the chat box here when I'm done. What we can plant close to overwintering sites is nectar sources, and we can plant those also throughout the migratory range of the butterfly. And this applies to the eastern population, especially for those monarchs flying south, really to fuel them up so they can make it to Mexico. The same applies in the western population as well. How can we fatten up monarchs so they can make it to the coast and really do well? And to help in that, Xerces has put together a whole series of monarch nectar plant guides that you're able to get that not only are for California, but we've got guides for the entirety of the United States that can really help you make decisions about what are the best, and this is scientifically derived, data or lists we've gathered from the research community and volunteers out there observing to figure out what are those best monarchs, best nectar plants to plant to help fuel that migration. The other thing that I think is actually quite fun and engaging is that you all can, as part of your communities, as individuals, with schools, can really help us answer key research questions about how best to aid the Western monarch recovery. And the best way to do that is to partner with us through the Monarch Milkweed Mapper. And this is a tool where you can sign on, and as you are out in nature, as you are out in your backyard, as you are out in maybe a local park, you can help us find and document where we see monarch caterpillars feeding and living in the wild, where we can find milkweed. You go to the mapper and you help us create a map of milkweed sightings, native milkweed sightings especially, of where we see adult monarchs, of where we see larval monarchs. We've been taking that data and working with colleagues at places like the University of Nevada, Reno, to develop models and maps that help us target where is the best, or where's there the best potential for high quality monarch habitat throughout the Western Range, where we can then work with agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, or even homeowners to make decisions about where to really target resources to put great habitat on the ground. So with that, I will leave you with a thank you and the chance to answer some questions at the end after we're done with all these presentations. And Chris, if it's okay, there are a number of resources that I've thought of that Xerces has produced. One of our jobs, one of the things I'm most proud about are the number of resources we've developed to help everybody from homeowners to landowners to roadside managers to farmers and ranchers, help them understand how to establish milkweed, what nectar plants to choose, what are native milkweeds in their areas, how do you collect native milkweed seed, how do you propagate native milkweed seed for yourself. Just a whole suite of tools that I'll put into the chat box just so people can see what's out there for resources to really help do all these great things that you guys are talking about. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Mace. Wonderful. So I'm going to go back to the screen share. So I can take over from here, I believe. It just takes a second to wind up, I think. Okay, and obviously I'd like there to be a lot of people that come forward from our Rotary community to say, yes, I want to take on a project somewhere in the West. So let's see if we can do that. I want to start with, just to wrap this up, just to just go around through the monarch life cycle again, and some of the experiences that I've had with the monarch in managing them for the last decade or so. So small beginnings. We've obviously got to do something about this butterfly. Insects are really under threat everywhere. There are fewer insects around than there were a decade ago and 5 decades ago. The monarch butterfly in the east is probably down to 1% to 10% of what it was with historical numbers 50 to 100 years ago. And so the butterfly really does need help. The next I want to just talk briefly about, it's a really crazy, hazardous world out there for butterflies. And I just want to show you a couple of things about that. Raising monarchs is not difficult, but I want to show you some quick tips on how to do it properly, carefully, and not damage the butterflies or disorient them. I also want to talk to you just briefly about protecting milkweed, because without the milkweed, you don't have the butterflies, because you don't have the caterpillars. And then butterflies are addicted to sugar. They're sugary drinks. They're like 20% soda water in a little tube of a flower. And then I just want to touch base on a couple of things like the costs of putting a garden in. Okay, so here's some of the creatures that we do like and some we don't, and definitely don't. So the top two left, there's the small milkweed bug and the red milkweed beetle. Then on the top right is our absolute nemesis. This is a techinid fly. A techinid fly will lay an egg inside a second, third, fourth instar, and then that egg will dangle out of the pupa usually and turn into a fly and fly away. On the bottom right, we have what we'd call an antlion. An antlion is a little creature. It's the larval stage of that nice, pretty beetle that's on the next across there, a lady beetle. And generally it eats aphids, but it also eats anything else that's soft, like an egg, like a monarch egg that's on a monarch plant, on a milkweed. So this is one of the, it's a larger lady beetle, and you'll see them around. Next is across there, this is the large milkweed bug. And the difference you can see, one has a cross, and the cross is like a typical cross. The other one is like an X. And so this one with an X, it's an insect sucker as well. So it goes around and eats, loves to have these aphids and eggs. And then probably the nastiest is the anchor bug, which is a stink bug that just likes to suck the juices out of monarchs and carry them up the plant and leave the carcasses on the top of the plant. It's a pretty ugly creature. And also there are other things like praying mantises will do this as well. Just really briefly, you know the monarch cycle. I mentioned to you before, the egg is actually quite small, but really distinctive. The monarch second instar that we have here would actually turn around, and it will eat its skin. That might sound gross, but it actually is really conservative, because obviously the skin is actually good for it. It has lots of nutrients in there, obviously. the stages that this goes through, each one of these stages is about 4 days, 3 to 4 days. An egg is an egg for about 3 to 4 days. Each of the instars, and there are 5 instars of the monarch caterpillar. And so people ask me all the time, how long is the life cycle? So it's about 3 to 4 days, and it really does depend on temperature. When it goes to the J formation on the lower right, it hangs there for usually 4 hours to 12 hours. Depends on what day it goes into the J formation. Then for about 20 minutes, it will break into this green pupa that's really flexible and fluid. And it will then shrink up. At about 20 minutes of its life cycle, it's like this, and it wriggles. And it's a really interesting thing to see. Then it will sit as the pupa for 10 to 14 days. And the pupa, this also depends on temperature. And so if the temperature is right, and then it will not take 14 days, it will take 10 days to go through. The other thing that I've noticed is that if it's in the spring, or actually it's May and June for me, the butterflies that are going to fly north, the pupa will have that golden band facing north. And then when it's going south, that golden band will be pointing south. I've never seen this published anywhere, but this is an observation I've made probably over 1,000 pupa that I've had go to emerge and release. And so I'll come back to that in a second. And then of course we've got, this is a male monarch sitting on a branch that I just released. Okay, I just want to talk about some best friends of milkweeds. And they are the big bees. Big bees actually take the pollinium, which is the pollen sac, and take that away. It's not like pollen that normally butterflies do. So to save the milkweed, we need to save the big bees, the bumblebees and things like that. Otherwise, we will lose the milkweed as well, because they won't get pollinated. The milkweed's worst nightmare, I believe, is the tussock moth. And unlike the monarch, which will generally lay 1 or possibly 2 or 3 eggs on a plant, the tussock moth will lay thousands of eggs on a plant, on a leaf, and it would devour the whole plant really rapidly. And so there's a hatchlings at the bottom right, which are just a couple of probably a day old or less, and then the adult larva is on the top left, the top right, sorry. Why do I raise butterflies? And a lot of people argue that you shouldn't be doing it. I only bring in the first eggs and the first instar only. I don't bother with the later ones because they're likely to have technid flies in them. I grow them up in small containers, transfer them into a terrarium at the third instar. I never, ever, ever touch a larva at any time. Change the leaves every 3 days. I actually add new leaves in. I don't take the old leaves out. Never overcrowd the terrarium. Never reorient the terrarium at all, because then you're going to, I believe, affect the butterfly or the caterpillar as it gets ready to set itself to fly away in the direction it wants to go. Don't disturb the jay. Occasionally, a butterfly, as it's emerged, will fall. You can catch it and pick it up back up again and put it back within minutes. If you don't, then it's gone. I release butterflies after about 8 hours, and then the main reason I would like to grow butterflies and caterpillars in captivity and release them is because the technid fly can infect up to 80% of the wild population of larvae. And whereas in captivity, I can keep the technid fly away from it entirely, and I get at least 95% survival. Now I'd just like to turn to the costs of putting in a butterfly garden. And so this is just a broad scale cost. This is what we generated for schools. To put a garden in of around about 500 square feet, it would cost around about $2,000 in all. Basically, in the plants that you would put in the preparatory materials you'd have to do that. And the number of hours you can see there, up to around about 100 hours, so 150 hours is what's required in setting it up. And then you probably have to go back once every 4 months or so just to make sure that it's being kept by the school. In the exchange program that William was talking about, the total costs are around about $1,000 to set that up and get it going. And for a tree nursery with about 750 native tree saplings, it's going to cost around about $3,000 to do that. So that you can see the support from Rotary in small grants can really help get these programs going. Or as Judy said, it might be completely free. You might have people that donate the plants for you. Okay, and with that, I'm just going to go back to this slide that we had up here before. This is the typical thing that you have with a school program. I have on the left-hand side, there's the science teacher. Then there's the school administrator running across the front, lady there. The bunch of the rest of them, most of them are Rotarians. There's a couple of parents that are in there, and the headmaster is the guy with the blue cap at the back. So that when you get involved with a school, you get the whole of the community school community to be involved in that. And I just want to mention, finally, there are some great resources out there, and particularly for the Monarch. It was really picked up in around about 2010, and maybe the next photograph will show you why. But there's a really good movie that you can see, The Flight of the Butterfly, from 2012, and Xerces, as you've heard, is a really great resource, working with Natural Resource Conservation Service. And a bunch of those organizations along the top line there, National Park Service, Fish, they have programs regularly. They also have funds available for you to tap into. And I won't go through the rest, but you'll be able to capture this and see each of these organizations is a really great help, a great resource for the monarch butterfly everywhere around the country and into Canada. And with that, I'd just like to leave you with this and ask you for any questions. And yes, the First Lady was really keen about the monarch butterfly. And so there we go. Stop sharing and we look for your questions and answers.
Okay, this is Ariel from Cincinnati. We have people from 7 countries here today, which is really exciting. And a lot of great networking has already been occurring in the chat. A number of Rotarians in Mexico have reached out to Cesar to get involved, which is very exciting. And I'd like to start with a question from Carlos Ivan Montoyo Perez. He wants to know, does the quality of water of the rivers like the Rio Grande affect the monarch butterfly?
I'd be glad to answer that. Okay. And I'll refer specifically to Mexico. Typically, the monarchs need hydration. okay? And they're very attracted to small streams. So my answer would be, it's more the quality of the small streams, and that's where they need good water, and they love the water. Whereas a river, you wouldn't find a monarch landing on the surface of a river like the Rio Grande. And I don't know if that answers the question, but the streams such as at El Rosario, within the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, are very populated by monarchs. They'll spend a good part of the day when they're off the trees and not flying around, hovering around the little streams. They find places where the water is just very gentle and approachable. Okay.
I think Carlos, Cesar would like to add to that probably as well.
Unmute.
Can I speak in Spanish about this answer? But en general, en México también tenemos la situación de que una gran cantidad de pesticidas se utiliza, bueno, igual que en otros países, y termina llegando a la parte de nuestros mantos freáticos, a los ríos y a la parte del subsuelo. Entonces, como comentó William, efectivamente termina afectando los flujos migratorios. Por eso es importante que nuestros ríos también sean lo mejor saneados o tratados posible. Pero efectivo. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Cesar raised the point that in places, especially where there are farmlands that use insecticides, that this can be a very serious problem. So it might not be that whether the water is clear or muddy, it's the matter of whether there's any pesticide that's gotten into the water.
I'd like to mention we're going to have a webinar next week. Is it, Christopher, on the 11th about soil health? And maybe that will relate to ways that we can prevent some of this runoff.
Right. It's not actually a webinar. It's a Zoom meeting, and everybody's welcome to join in that if you'd like to get on the list, and we will get that out to you.
That's good to know. I work in sustainable agriculture also.
Yeah.
I'll put that information in the chat. Can I put your email address, Chris, if people would like to get the Zoom link?
Thank you.
Okay. Then some really fun questions. Ken Wentworth wants to know, Chris, if you banned your captive and release butterflies.
No, I don't. I don't do that at all. I think there's some of that going on, but I'd prefer not to hamper a butterfly in any way of getting back to where it needs to go. And just for 1 gram butterfly, even the little tiny sticker, which probably is maybe 1/100th of a gram, is still something that's attached to the wing of a butterfly. And I'd personally prefer not to do that, because we know basically where the migration is going now. And I think back in the early days when we were looking at that, then yes, it was important to find out something about it. But now I personally I don't do the tagging.
One of the participants wants to know what can she do at home?
Who's that to?
Anybody who would like to address that?
Okay. My garden, which had maybe 5 or 6 native plants in it, now has 150 different species of natives from Maryland, and I guess I grow more than that in my greenhouse. So I'm lucky, but so there are resources out there. Natural Resource Conservation Service does have a plant distribution place where you can touch base with them. These are plant resource centers, and every now and then I see some notes coming out from them to say that they have materials available. And so, but obviously, Mace has indicated that he has lists of species that are, and basically what you would have to do is just choose the plants that are in your area and then go to a local nursery and see if they've got them. And generally, in most states have 1 or 2 native plant nurseries that are just purely growing native plants. And it's worthwhile just finding out who they are and touching base with them.
And we've got a pollinator conservation resource center that has a link to help you find those native plant nurseries. And the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has similar resources, and you can check in with your native plant society. They're often really very good about helping you to track down folks like Chesapeake Natives and other native plant producers. Just as a quick reminder, in the chat box are links to those native plant lists and Monarch, milkweed guides. I can repost those if you want, but if you just scroll up into the chat box, there are a number of links there to help you figure out, what species you might choose that are really high graded for monarchs when it comes to nectar species in particular.
Very good.
I would like to invite people, if you are organizing informational webinars in other parts of the world, and particularly in other languages, we have a newsletter that goes out once a month, and we also have social media. We have a LinkedIn page and a Facebook page for ESRAG. We would love to publicize your webinars. And so I'm going to put my email address in the chat as well. Because we would love to get the word out so you can share the great work you're doing with other people.
Ariel, I noticed that Michael Terrelong has asked about the monarchs in the Caribbean. And I've seen monarchs, I was actually going to mention about the monarchs that have basically got out of the North America. There are some in South America. So in Trinidad and Tobago, I've seen the monarch butterfly there. And if you go to South Africa, you can find it there. It's an invasive species. In Australia, it's an invasive species. And in Southern Europe, it's an invasive species as well. I believe it's also touch base now in India. Essentially, wherever there are milkweeds, the monarch seems to now be popping up. So this is why I mentioned earlier that the monarch's not going to be an endangered species, but it's the amazing flyways that it has in America are really endangered. It's also in Hawaii. In Hawaii, the monarch is actually not as orange as it is here in the United States. And that's probably got something to do with maybe it doesn't need to put resources into the color because whatever's eating it is not really, doesn't know what it is yet.
And Chris, I would add to that too, while we have those butterflies, and I think you're alluding to this all across the world, they're not part of that migration. So the butterflies that we do have, the monarchs that are in the Caribbean, they're not, to our knowledge, contributing to those butterflies that are flying to overwinter in Michoacan and then be able to distribute, fly back up into the United States. They're like the Florida population that's non-migratory. There's a population in Southern Florida that's just there, just like in the Caribbean or Australia or Hawaii, et cetera. They're just not contributing to this amazing migration back and forth. Just another little detail.
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
Okay, there are a lot of questions about creatures. Robert Zimmerman would like to know, how do you define big bee?
Okay, so I'm talking about bumblebees. And so bees go for everything from there are bee flies, and then there are bees. So there are small bees that are up to 1 to 2 millimeters long, and there are bees that are a good 10 to 15 millimeters long, so up to about half an inch. So I'm talking about the bees that The big bees just bigger than usually bigger than a honeybee. If you know, the honeybee is about the smallest bee that can actually drag out the polonium, which is that pollen sac, from the flower of the milkweed. You actually often find bees that have tried to get to the polonium actually dead on the milkweed flower, because they've struggled so much to try and get the polonium out that they've died of exhaustion trying to get it. But so the bigger bees are the ones that can actually pull that polonium out of the flower and take it away.
The other piece I would add to that about milkweed is, even if you're in a place that doesn't have monarchs, there are hundreds of species of insect pollinators that visit the flowers. So while you need let's say, I would think of them as a medium size, like honeybees in my mind are medium sized growing up into the big bumblebees. But so if you've got one of these bigger bees, you need that to pollinate the flower, but you could have dozens of other bees, even those tiny little ones, visiting and gathering nectar from those flowers. And in fact, it's just an amazing plant to plant if you just want to support flies, wasps, beetles, bees, butterflies, moths. There's just a tremendous variety of insects that visit the flowers to gather nectar. And then those bigger ones, as Chris is alluding to, will grab the polinia up. And in fact, a lot of times now, those bees actually are stuck, Chris. They actually are, their legs get caught where the polonium are housed, and they will literally get themselves caught and not be able to get out. And I've seen a lot of honeybees do that. They're not the brightest tools in the shed sometimes. And I've seen butterflies occasionally caught just by getting their legs stuck in that crown-shaped flower. Anyway, it's just kind of interesting.
There we go. You're muted, Aria.
A question about migration and populations in California. Patricia Brown has a number of really good questions. She wants to know if monarchs lay eggs in Mexico. Do they feed while they are overwintering in Mexico? And in the Western Migration Corridor, do they lay eggs throughout all habitats in California or concentrate in certain areas? Where is the best place to plant pollinator gardens in California?
Good question. Why don't I quickly share my screen just to look at that map. It'll just take a second. And this is an early version of our models. But when it comes to California right now, oops, oh, I'm sorry, I've just blocked there. You know, there's a big focus on the Central Valley, a lot of these sort of Inland Empire areas, the foothills of the Sierra. There are just a number of places throughout California. For the coast, this focus here on high suitability is really meant to focus on nectar plants. So butterflies overwintering sometimes will need to refuel, and they'll break out of their clusters temporarily, and having nectar sources along the coast is important. And we actually have some updated versions of this. This is actually a couple years old, but we're concentrating on the coastal foothills of the coastal sort of mountain ranges that run along the coast, the foothills of the Sierra, and the Central Valley, to try to create safe havens as butterflies move across that heavily managed, that heavily ag concentrated Central Valley, to try to help them get through it, to get through into the western part of their range, because eventually they'll head up to these red areas here in the Snake River Plateau, eastern Washington. You know, these are some of the places we're hoping to be able to get monarchs to, so they can turn around and return. So those are some of the high value areas that we're looking at, and I'll stop sharing. Give me a second.
So Mason, just
There.
to add on from that, I generally, when I'm giving presentations, I really stress that the larva eats and the butterfly drinks, just to make it really clear, because people often think that that a butterfly has to eat. The butterfly doesn't have any chewing parts. It then just has this straw that it can get into the flower to drink the fluid out. It doesn't have anything to chew, whereas the larva, the caterpillar, does.
Chris, and I'd like
That's
to add to that.
fantastic.
part of the problem that the monarch has faced in places, including like California. And in its journey down to Mexico, in the case of the eastern population, it all filters down to Texas, is when there's severe drought conditions, there's a lack of flowers and hence a lack of nectar to fuel their journey. And that seems to often stop them in their tracks. And also, going back to the early question about the hydration, where they actually drink water per se, not just nectar. They need those spots. And if there are severe drought conditions, those spots aren't there anymore. Right. So it's a real problem for the monarchs.
So Mace, you might like to comment about this. I've seen butterflies sort of puddling on sandy soil, just moist soil, and rather than going to water sources themselves, but just on the moisture that's on the surface is where I generally see butterflies taking up moisture.
Yeah, and they're often doing that for two reasons: to either gather some moisture, but more often than not, they're gathering minerals. And it's often particularly seen in males that they're gathering minerals from that moisture. And they don't tend to like, they want to have a damp area. It's, even the Rio Grande, the banks of the Rio Grande could be a place where, butterflies would gather, and mud puddle, for example, but they're not going to be in the river itself. It's those moist, muddy areas, those damp areas that they're going to get resources. And thinking about drought, it's another reason to focus on our native plants, because many of our native plants, particularly when they become well established, are relatively drought resistant, which gives us an extra defense, I guess, in those dry years. That's something to keep in mind.
At least they can get nectar.
Yeah.
We've come to we're at I guess 5 minutes off 1.5 hours. So maybe we should be getting to the end of this webinar, but if we've got further questions, anything that Ariel thinks we should really take care of right now, got just a couple of minutes. Otherwise, please send all your questions through by email. We will be just more than happy to address them. Particularly Judy, she'd like to just take it away.
Just a couple more questions about hazards. There's been some conversation in the chat between Amada and Gloria about milkweed plants from big box stores that contain pesticides, I guess. So that would be really pretty depressing. Gloria says Home Depot offers milkweed containing neonicotinoids for purchase to homeowners.
Chris, can I tackle this just for a second? Because I do think this is a pretty important issue. Yeah, so and this is actually not just big box stores. One of the challenges within the nursery industry are requirements of plants cross state lines for them not to have pests, for them to be pristine, for them to sell. They need to look fantastic. And to do that, frequently they are treated with insecticides. And over the last couple of decades, increasingly treated with what are called systemic insecticides. Those neonicotinoids are an example of that, where they're put into the soil and then systemically taken up into the plant. So one concern that we all have is that whether it's milkweeds or even nectar plants you might buy, that they may be contaminated with these these insecticides inside the plant. And as you can imagine, if a monarch caterpillar feeds on that, that's not going to end well. So one thing that's actually been effective, even with big box stores, is that when you go to buy plants, to ask, to just put the question out there. It doesn't have to be confrontational. Just say, hey, I need to buy plants for the monarch butterfly or pollinators, and I would like for them not to have insecticides. And we've had a number of nurseries here in the West, make a pledge to say, hey, these plants are not treated with systemic insecticides. And just by asking the question, consumers can really have a meaningful difference. Is it solving everything yet? No. And we've got these challenges, like I said, of plants moving across state lines. But particularly, it's another reason to go to a small nursery, a local nursery, a native plant nursery. And by bringing this up, really try to help them know that, hey, look, the people who are buying my plants, my customers, want to see plants that aren't going to potentially poison our pollinators.
I get asked every year, and guaranteed every year I get asked the question, do I use any insecticides? And we don't use any whatsoever. We don't apply anything. Yeah.
And that's what we buy from you, Chris.
Let me just ask one more. Robert Zimmerman wants to know what plants are poisonous to monarchs.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, monarchs. So the monarch will only lay her eggs on milkweed. So they're not going to lay, if they lay eggs on something else, they'll be just completely confused and they wouldn't be out, they'll just die. The egg will hatch and there won't be any food for it. But in terms of if you're talking about the butterfly drinking, then most plants that produce nectar is just essentially 20% sugar water. And so it's really, I don't think that there's certainly some selectivity between different butterflies for different species, but you know, I think it's, as far as the monarch goes, it's fairly much a generalist when it goes for its for nectar. What do you say, Mace?
I would overall 98% agree with that. The only little odd counter example might be dogbane. And dogbane is very closely related to milkweed and, you know, is a plant that sometimes people mistake and maybe try to feed to monarchs, or there's some thought that maybe occasionally monarchs might lay an egg on it and then the butterfly hatches and can't feed on it. But that's pretty unusual. I mean, there really isn't anything that, you know, any plants that monarchs are going to really actively choose in any meaningful way that's going to be poisonous to them. I mean, unless they're sprayed with insecticides. But yeah, really no, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Here, I'll put a link.
Okay, Ariel, I think it's time for me to wrap up. You give me the thumbs up. So I'd like to thank our audience for staying with us through this presentation. It has been recorded. We'll probably divide it up into segments so that you can take it as segments, or and then we'll also probably have it as the long version. We are also going to record this in Spanish, so there will be a Spanish version of the whole, at least the presentations part, and also we'll have Cesar's part translated in English, so that there'll be a Spanish version and an English version available to everybody in due course. Except and the question and answer will probably just be as a separate section, just as it is. So with that, I'd like to thank my presenters today. It's been a pleasure to work with you all, and we just are looking forward to great things for the monarch butterfly across the United States. And of course, anybody who's been listening in from overseas, there are so many things that just apply to what you're dealing with what we've been talking about today. With that, I'd just like to sign off. Thanks, Ariel, for taking the questions. William, Cesar, Judith, and Mace, so pleased to have you all.
Thank you, Chris, for your leadership.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye now.